running the Centre for Geopolitics and International Policy at IPPR. That's quite a new beast. This is our second event as part of the centre, so that's a really exciting moment for us. What we try to do in the centre is ask the big questions about UK foreign policy and explore what a progressive approach looks like in these difficult times. So we thought this morning we'd take on the big one, the future of the special relationship in the changing world. I don't know about you, but I find the phrase special relationship makes me cringe a little. Of course, our two countries have a deeply meaningful and close history, and our alliance has delivered essential things for both nations and for the world at large. But I think I pause or cringe because it's not clear to me that the relationship is equally special to both sides, and the trotting out of the phrase feels a little like a more powerful nation repeating back to a smaller ally what it wants to hear. And maybe that's fine in easier times, but the question of how special the relationship really is has been supercharged, especially since the arrival of the Trump administration in power earlier this year. And the question of how much we matter to the US and how aligned we are feels pretty fundamental. And it also forces us to think about what we as the UK want from that relationship, which is a pretty knotty issue to unravel, because we know that the security order in Europe at a very shaky time is underpinned by US power and resources. And we know that the US matters enormously to our economy and could matter even more as AI and deep tech become central in advanced economies, and with the US such a hub of these capabilities. But in a world where power is more diffuse, the US is more internally focused, and it's taken a decisive shift away from liberal values and from democracy. Is it time to make the relationship less special? And if so, how? Luckily, I've got three fantastic panellists joining us this morning who are going to give us the answer to these questions. So to my immediate left, Calum is the Liberal Democrat, Member of Parliament for Bicester and Woodstock, and the party's Foreign Affairs spokesperson. He was previously a senior civil servant, including Principal Private Secretary to the Cabinet Secretary Gus O'Donnell and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. Olivia Sullivan is Director of the UK and the World Programme at Chatham House, and before joining Chatham House, Olivia worked for over a decade in international development and foreign policy across the UK government. And then on the far end, Gideon Rachman has been Chief Foreign Affairs columnist for the FT since 2006, and he joined after a 15-year career at The Economist. So really delighted to have all three of you joining us this morning. I'm going to open by asking each of you just to give a few thoughts on how special the special relationship is at the moment and should be. Then I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll make sure to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions from the room. Calum.
Thanks so much, Laura. Real pleasure to be here this morning, and as you've asked, we'll try and be brief so that we can have plenty of time for discussion and answer the questions of those in the room. So my quick answer to your question is that the special relationship is important to the UK, that we do need it, but that it should become less singular and less central over time. I think we can all see that there has been what I would argue to be an over-dependence on the US in certain key areas in the recent past, and there have been significant changes both in the UK and in global politics that render that questionable given where we are today. Let's start quickly with trying to define the areas of the special relationships just so they're on the table and we can contest them if people want to. Principal areas, it seems to me, are in security, defence and intelligence. The economic relationship is there, and of course all of that is overlaid with deep cultural, historic, linguistic ties. But I think we'll probably keep coming back in this conversation to some of the core dependencies that the UK has on the US when it comes to aspects of our key strategic defence capabilities, intelligence sharing and so on. And those are some of the areas we need to think about if we're serious about rebalancing, decoupling, or thinking harder about that relationship. Both our countries, I would argue, have been challenged by triple crises since mid-2000s of a financial, political and global health dimension, which have had big impacts on all three countries and led to changes in our domestic politics. But they've also led to changes in outlook for both countries and particularly for the US. Following Brexit, I think the UK needs to decide where our position is in the world. my argument would be that we cannot go it alone, and consequently need to face up to the blocks that we have. I would argue in the economic realm there are three major blocks, the US, China and the EU. And the security realm, I would argue there are 2.5, and I'll let you work out where the half is. So with that in mind, the UK needs to think hard about what our alignment is going to be and where our alliances are. We face a particular challenge with this US administration. The problems with President Trump's approach to international relations are pretty clear to anybody. He's an unreliable partner, he's deeply transactional, and really quite importantly, he has demonstrated himself to be hostile to some of the UK's other allies. And that presents a pretty fundamental challenge when you're thinking about how you position yourself in the world. I think the problems with China are fairly self-evident. We can go into those in more detail. But that leaves the UK, in my view, falling back to focusing more on our relationship with our European partners, both in the security realm, where Russia challenges all of us, and in the economic realm, where our ties are deep and important. And therefore, my argument would be that we need to consider carefully that relationship. So just to finish with a kind of metaphor, I think it's often felt to me in the years over the last 40 to 50 years as though the UK has been in a slightly long-term and resented relationship with the European Union. We're sort of cohabiting at times, but not particularly enthusiastic about coming home to one another. And then whenever we get the phone call from our glamorous friend across the Atlantic, we remember that special relationship, put on our finery and go rushing out, leaving our long-standing partner behind. My argument would be that we should be slightly less allured by the United States and slightly more serious about the partner who has most common interests and values with us, and that should be more of the UK's anchor into the future.
Fantastic, thank you. Olivia, turn to you.
Thank you, thanks very much for having me today. I was going to try and build on Calum's metaphor, but I think if we take it too far, it's but Calum, thank you for laying out some of the areas where the UK has these obvious dependencies to think about. I thought I would bring to this question another angle, which is if we're thinking about how central should the special relationship remain to UK foreign policy, I think my answer would be it should remain central, precisely because we need to be thinking very carefully and long-term and strategically about what we do about a less American world and an America less committed to Europe. And I worry a bit that because Trump is so absorbing and so changeable, even if we think about just the state visit and the amount of diplomatic effort and time that took up just to manage one strand of the relationship, getting that tariff deal at least somewhere, if not completely, where the UK government wanted it to be, there's a risk that we end up in this pattern of reactivity to this very absorbing and central figure. And I think what we need to ask are two things. Where is the US going and where is US politics going? And where will UK interests lie in 5, 10, 15 years? And on where US politics is going, I think there's two principal directions for the US right that it might be helpful to think about. One is this very transactional direction, which Trump tends to embody, although not always, depends on the mood. But very difficult, very blunt, very quid pro quo, and we see that embodied by the approach to, for example, European defence spending, when essentially when the answer was, okay, yes, we'll kick up the GDP percentage targets for defence spending, is to some degree satisfied. The US isn't shouldering the burden of European security so much anymore. Okay, we can do a deal. But I think the other direction is this kind of civilizational turn among the US, right, where they are much more interested in the domestic internal politics of other countries and much more prepared to pronounce on things like speech, things like gender, things like the governance of immigration, and much more prepared to get involved. And I think you see that somewhat more embodied in J.D. Vance and his kind of camp within the Republicans. We should keep in mind that Trump is very old and he might die. It's not a controversial thing to say. Vance might become president, but equally, I think the UK and the UK government and UK policymakers need to be keeping an eye on which direction is the US right going, because it means very different things for us in terms of how we defend our own interests. And the US left too. I think we've obviously had these very eye-catching recent victories, particularly Mamdani in New York. So you have this kind of more left grouping in the party, but I think in terms of their future candidates and future presidential election, it's always worth looking at these governors who tend to be ready candidates for future presidency, for future presidential runs. So people like Pritzker in Chicago, Beshear in Kentucky, Newsom in California, and these somewhat more orthodox Democrats. But regardless, I think on both sides of the spectrum, you're not really seeing a return to either that kind of Clintonian idea of being in favour of globalisation, free trade, nor that kind of Biden orientation towards transatlanticism. So either way, on either side of the aisle, we're not seeing a kind of return to the America of the past. And I think we need to keep our eye on that long-term question of where US politics is going. And I'll stick to keeping it short. In terms of where UK interests lie, on security, it seems obvious and critical to me that we build up our collective capabilities with fellow Europeans. Given that direction of US politics on both sides of the aisle, they are not going to continue, the Americans, to want to underwrite European security. And I think the big thing we need to do here is, there's been a lot of pronouncements about this and a lot of good first steps, but I worry the momentum is slightly draining from the EU-UK security and defence partnership. There's clearly squabbles over the UK's participation in the SAFE, or access to the SAFE instrument. And we need to really carefully identify these specific military capabilities on which we're dependent on the Americans. So you mentioned intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, air capabilities, getting quite specific about what gaps, what areas would need to be filled in a less American world. On trade and growth, I think similarly thinking carefully about what kind of trade order does the UK want to build with others, beyond being somewhat at the mercy of a rather kind of whimsical current Trumpian policy of imposing tariffs in order to extract concessions. But just a final note of caution, in this discussion we often talk as if our critical choices are between the US and Europe, and I agree many of them are. There will be some choices between the US and China in this, particularly around things like which power between the US and China is dominant in tech infrastructure and dominant in the global economy. And that complicates our choices significantly and means that that relationship with the US, I think, does need to continue to be central to some degree in our foreign policy. So I'll stop there.
Super, thank you. Gideon.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I wish I could say I violently disagree with anything that's been said before. I actually don't. So I'll just use the remarks as a kind of jumping off point. I mean, I think that when you were saying earlier that there's a sort of neediness to the special relationship, and that has been a concern in Britain for a long time, and it leads some people, I think, sometimes to say there is no special relationship because it's like a figment of the British imagination to kind of make ourselves feel important. Actually, we don't matter in Washington. And I think if you think of it on an emotional level, you could make that argument. But as I've sort of covered this, I've sort of come to the conclusion that there is very much a special relationship, but it's a structural special relationship built up over kind of 80 years, and particularly, as Calum was saying, in defence and security. And in some ways, in the Trump era, it would be a lot simpler if there wasn't a special relationship, because we wouldn't have these deep dependencies. But as a matter of fact, they exist. And intelligence is probably the most obvious example. And the integration, say, between GCHQ and the NSA is very intense, I think, and similarly between MI6 and the CIA. And that's a sort of daily operational thing, which obviously is not that visible, but is very real. And I think that the idea of ditching it would cause a kind of level of panic in the British security establishment. In fact, when I interviewed Sir Alex Younger, former head of MI6, for my podcast, and I said to him, we have this dependency in intelligence, also nuclear weapons, where the British nuclear deterrent is not fully independent because the private missiles, are manufactured and serviced in the United States, as I understand it. And I said to Younger, given that, is it imaginable that we could kind of turn our back on this? And he said, well, you've just answered your own question, really. It's not. So I think, in extremis, anything's imaginable, but there's this deeply embedded security relationship which has built up a dependency over decades. And that is a very hard thing to turn your back on. However, I think that the advent of Trump did start a debate, which again, I've caught bits of in various conversations, about how much we should really make an effort to reduce our dependencies on the United States. I've heard it argued from one that we should begin to de-risk from the United States just as we de-risk from China. That we should start reducing our arms purchases from America, going more indigenous, doing more with Europeans, and even start looking at American involvement in critical infrastructure, which could be weaponized, just as we were worried about Chinese involvement in critical infrastructure. However, from observation, I would say that people arguing for that are losing, because actually, if you look at the recent decisions made, they seem to me to actually strengthen the dependence on the United States, or at least continue it. The decision to develop the nuclear deterrent with a second leg with the airborne, which involves, I think, F-35s, purchasing F-35s, the deep involvement with Palantir, a very important American defense tech company, even AUKUS, which preceded Trump, but is, it's Australia, UK, US, and is regarded as crucial to our defense industrial base. That's been renewed, re-emphasized. So I don't actually see much of this de-risking from the United States. There are projects you could point to, the joint fighter that Italy, Japan, and the UK are developing, which is perhaps a step in that direction. Potentially participation in SAFE, as Olivia was saying, but even that's looking quite problematic. So I think the British, again, I'm on the outside, so sort of eavesdropping a bit, but I think the British establishment has considered the idea of de-risking, but it just sort of found it too difficult, so they're not going to do it for now. But that in itself does create a risk, because it creates a dependence, and which can be used against you. And I'm sure there are plenty of examples. One that stuck in the head was from the first Trump administration, where again, as Calum was saying, this triangular relationship with China is really important, where Britain was thinking of taking Chinese 5G through Huawei. I'm not commenting on whether that was a good or bad idea, but I've no doubt that extremely heavy American pressure in threatening the special relationship on intelligence was crucial in making us say, okay, we're not going to do that. So the Americans have these levers they can apply, and then more lately in the tariffs, if the car industry is essentially threatened by the US, what are you going to do? You more or less have to do whatever you can to keep it alive. At least that seemed to be the reaction of the Starmer administration. And so I think we're a bit stuck, but all I'd say is that I don't think it's necessarily forever, and nor are we in a completely unique situation. I mean, there are unique elements to the special relationship, the nuclear stuff, the intelligence stuff, but the generality of deep dependence on the United States built up over alliances and security applies to Japan. It even applies to the EU. The Japanese, in some ways, in an even worse situation, because they don't actually have an option to theoretically turn to Asian equivalent of the EU. That doesn't exist. So they've had to accept a really humiliating trade deal with Trump, where they pledged to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the United States, where Trump gets to decide where the investments are made, and 90% of the profits are kept by the Americans. I can't believe a sovereign nation would agree to that, but they have. I mean, I think they think they can fudge it over time, but still, that shows you that the kind of dependency they feel. And now I think the EU situation is analogous, not, as I say, in the sort of intelligence nuclear element, but particularly because of the Ukraine war. The Europeans thought, we cannot afford a break with America. I think they might have actually retaliated on the trade front had that not been happening. There was big debate in Brussels about maybe we should hit back with a 15% tariff on them. In the end, they swallowed the American tariffs. And why did they do that? Because they thought, if we hit back, Trump will withdraw American military support for Ukraine, or even the American military from Europe. He might pull out of NATO. That's just not a risk they can take at the moment. And I think that they think this is a 10-year project for the EU. We've got to sort of suck it up now. If the EU can get its act together, over the course of 10 years, they can build up more indigenous defense capabilities in all the areas we're talking about, satellite, heavy lifted aircraft, etc., etc. They can maybe tried to promote the use of the euro through the issuance of common debt. There are ways, they probably have more ways because they have a larger market, of freeing themselves from this excessive dependence on the United States. But it's not clear to me they'll get their act together, and even if they do, it's probably a decade-long project. And I think there is some analogy with Britain, that if you were thinking strategically and you could lift yourself above the sort of day-to-day maelstrom of stuff coming at you, I think that would have to be the goal. You keep the special relationship going, you certainly don't write it off, but you try to diversify and you try to make yourself less dependent on an America that's demonstrated that it's willing to weaponize that dependence.
Fantastic. Three brilliantly interesting and complementary interventions. So a couple of questions and then I'll open to the floor. So I was struck, Gideon, by you saying that the establishment sort of seems to have not taken on the project of de-risking, that we're a bit stuck. So are the establishment wrong? Should we be actively taking on this de-risking project? And if so, what's your recipe for it? So some of that we've heard, thinking about defence capabilities, collaborating with Europe, etc. What else would you add to that list? And I guess I'm particularly interested in, is this a moment where you want to join with a bloc, whether security or economic, or is this a moment where we reap the benefits of Brexit and we sail the waters, forming alliances with different groupings in different countries on different issues? Is the establishment wrong, and what do we do? Maybe let's do reverse, so Gideon first.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should be, I see glimpses of this, so there may be lots of things going on I don't know about. I have to be honest about that. So it's partly sort of observational, just certain key decisions that surface, and you think, oh, why would they have done that if they're trying to de-risk? I think that the defence stuff is important. There are agreements with Germany and so on. I think the problem is that the combination of AI and defence, which is very kind of the cutting edge stuff, does seem to be being done in the United States. There isn't a sort of European equivalent yet of Palantir or Admiral or whatever, and that is a difficulty. But we could perhaps help that along by working more closely with the French and Germans, etc., on actually trying to develop European alternatives. They don't have the scale of the Americans, but there are European defence companies that are coming up, which we could, I think, perhaps work more intensively with. And in terms of, whether we should, what other partners we should look at, I think it's got to be everybody. Realistically, even the most ardent Remainer, we're not going to rejoin the EU in the next, 5 years. Probably much longer than that. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a closer relationship with the EU. And I think one of the disappointments for me is that I think on both sides of the channel there is a theoretical realization that we're in a similar sort of spot, with Ukraine on the one side, with industrial pressure from China's very rapid development and the threat to manufacturing from that, and with Trump. And that obviously we should cooperate, but when it comes to it, it's easier to make big declarations that we're going to do it than to actually do stuff. But then I think that we do actually have a slightly freer hand because of Brexit to do other things. So you've seen the trade deal with India that's been reached. Britain's joined the CPTPP. These are not huge things, but if you do lots of them, cumulatively, you can improve your situation. And we should be looking to do that.
I agree with a lot of that. I think to your question, Laura, while I think there is some careful thinking in government, I largely do think it's very difficult in practice for official Britain to think about this relationship in a different way, and I do think that is a mistake. And that government is quite consumed by responding to the day-to-day. And I worry about where is the room or the team or the place where we are very carefully thinking through all of our linkages with the US as a power and how they're changing. I think in a way de-risking is not the most helpful term because it sort of confuses the issue. What we need are more options. And a bit more urgency around that joint defence investment with Europeans would be very welcome on both sides, on the UK side and on the European side. We share a problem here. And too often that kind of EU-UK discussion is falling back into old habits and old patterns. I agree with Gideon, we're not going to rejoin anytime soon, but there's plenty of good thinking about alternative ways of having a relationship with the EU that apply not just to the UK, but potentially to Ukraine, potentially to others, that share geopolitical and security interests with the EU that are not necessarily going to join an ever closer union. And I think it is time to look again more seriously at some of those ideas. I think also that there's more the UK could do in regards to some of those partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. As Gideon said, we particularly have some fellow middle powers in that region in a very similar position. Their principal security partner is becoming unreliable, and one of their important economic partners, China, is becoming more coercive and mercenary. So Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea have some very similar problems. So some very interesting ideas and initiatives around sharing intel approaches to critical supply chains. And we've seen Australia doing a lot of this, working with Japan, with South Korea. It's very difficult to actually share information about these kinds of very sensitive economic security questions, but we could potentially be doing more with some of those powers and making our relationships with some of those powers independent of the shared relationship with the US. And there may be more that could be done with CPTPP in that regard as the principal trade grouping in that region. So I think it's not de-risking so much as it is generating more options and deepening more relationships. But I think there should not just be sort of practical, how do we defend our security interests and economic interests angle to this. We need to think very carefully about that strand of the US right that is more authoritarian, that does have different values, and what values we share with some of our other allies in this regard. It's not necessarily going to be in the ascendant in American politics, but if it is, that changes the game a little bit more, in my view.
Fantastic.
Great. So I think your original question, Laura, is this a strategic error by the establishment, or are they failing? Look, I mean, I think about it in three lenses: defence, trade, and sort of technology and regulation. On the defence side, Trump's right. Europe hasn't taken responsibility for its own security for too long, but we should and could turn that more to our advantage in terms of our approach. So the very fact that the US is calling for that gives us more license to do more with our European partners and not offend or upset the US. And it's a disappointment that I think we haven't lent into that more strongly. And like having sat around some of these tables in Whitehall, I can sort of almost imagine the panic in intelligence chiefs and senior military leaders' eyes at the prospect of decoupling from the US, whether in intelligence or nuclear, as Gideon sets out. And it is very tempting to sort of scurry back to one safe place and hope that this will all blow over and we'll be back in a good position. And I was genuinely shocked by the lack of reaction in a strategic way to Pete Hesketh discussing operational plans on Signal. I mean, to me, that's a huge violation of the intelligence relationship. I'm not privy to what took place behind the scenes or how that was dealt with, but that should have been a huge marker that the culture, attitude and behaviour of the current US administration is a real threat to some of those partnerships. So I think it is taking one's eye off the ball, if it is indeed the case, and obviously we're not all privy to that information, that there is a sort of steady as she goes approach, and I hope that this will all blow over. I think the consensus on the panel is emerging that we do need to increase our resilience and to diversify in that respect. Briefly on trade, look, you know, Donald Trump is sort of setting the agenda because he likes to be in the news all the time and sees tariffs as his favourite plaything, and that is, you know, dominating discussion about world trade. What I think the opportunity is for the UK is to be a leader of open liberal democracies who are prepared to talk with one another about an alternative model. And that's not easy in the face of everyone's dependence to a greater or less degree on the US, but were the UK to be stronger in partnering with the likes of our Commonwealth partners, with Japan, with Canada, in order to talk about what it looks like to have open trade partnerships, then we'd be providing an alternative to this mercantilist approach that the Trump administration has adopted. And that leads me on to the second question you asked about, you know, are we doing enough to take advantage of our ability to be swashbuckling, independent party on the world stage. Look, ultimately it comes down to capacity and resources. The sucking sound of attention towards Washington has resulted in senior UK ministers spending, in my view, far too much time focused on that relationship and not enough on the wider relationships that would give the UK alternatives and resilience. And I don't just mean with our European partners, I mean more globally. I was speaking recently with a Brazilian ambassador who pointed out that prior to this week's COP, there hadn't been a visit by a British minister for over 2 years. Well, to one of the BRICS and a significant sort of growing economic power, that's quite a striking fact. And I think it speaks to both ministerial attention, but also to the hollowing out of our diplomatic capabilities. There is currently a budgetary proposal to cut the budget of the FCDO by 25%. And for those of us who think that our diplomacy is too focused on Washington at the moment, reducing our ability to interact with other countries, to support British exporters, and to have those trading relationships with other partners seem to me to be exactly the definition of, penny pinching that results in a diminishing of our ability to influence partners around the world.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask one more and then let's open up. I want to pick up on the values piece, because we've been quite sort of strategic in this conversation, which has meant we haven't named the hundreds of instances of really worrying and undemocratic and unrespecting of fundamental human rights behaviours that come from the Trump administration. And as you said, Olivia, it's not just one man, but a really interesting shift in terms of domestic US politics, both on the left and on the right, but particularly in with these characteristics on the right. So how important is it that the UK sees its response to the US through a values lens? And what does it actually do? Because on the one hand, it's tempting to sort of stand up and sort of make alternative values-based coalitions or statements, but that has strategic consequences, and it also doesn't necessarily deliver progressive objectives. So if we care, for example, about jobs in the UK and we're facing difficult tariffs, do we prioritise making sure our economy is resilient and those jobs are available? And how do we manage that alongside a desire to say the UK stands behind democracy and stands behind certain fundamental values? So, yeah, the tricky question. Calum, start with this time.
Sure. So to start where you sort of ended on the pragmatic side of the question, and I think it's really important in all of these relationships, whether it's how we approach the Trump administration, whether it's how we manage our relationship with China, to be fully mindful of the context. So don't go into it blindly unaware of what the costs might be of certain actions. But my and my party's criticism of the government's approach to China, and extends to the government's approach to the US, is that too often it hasn't been apparent where the red lines are. So a policy of continual accommodation where in the end your desire to be friendly with a country or not to put them on the wrong side of things, largely for economic reasons, results in you never standing up for your values, is not one where you are a respected partner. It's one where you're trodden over by a more dominant power who is setting the values agenda in that relationship. So I think we need to think deeply and carefully about where those red lines are. I think, as your question alluded to, there's a distinction between our commentary and observation of what any government is doing domestically and what it is tolerating and promoting externally. So, we can all look at what's happening with the politicisation of the courts in the US. We can look at the Trump administration's assault on the freedom of speech in universities and seeking to direct universities through withholding federal funding and the like. And we can look at those as steps on the way towards a more authoritarian approach, and we can be deeply worried about that. But whether or not we judge that it's right for us to be providing a running commentary on the internal affairs of another country is for us to decide. However, when the US starts attacking Venezuela, or on the pretext of a drugs campaign taking out individuals and assets in the Caribbean, it comes closer to a question that we might have a view on. And I think, just to come back to something that Olivia mentioned earlier, the idea that the US and the Vice President in particular feels more confident and more keen to comment on the individual media coverage of outlets in their fairly liberal and open press in the UK then he appears willing to comment on human rights outrages in other parts of the world is quite striking. So there's definitely a double standard taking place there, and to the extent that the special relationship may be underpinned by certain cultural associations, there is a slightly strange thing going on whereby the US leadership feels that it's right and proper for it to comment on cultural issues in other Western democracies, and yet apparently tolerate quite different cultures elsewhere without nearly the same level of commentary. So, I think my view is that the UK needs to be clear-sighted about our own values, clear enough on where the red lines are that we are prepared to stand up for them when they are infringed, to take a hard-headed view of what's right and proper when it comes to domestic versus international affairs, but to recognise, as Olivia's been highlighting, that there are scenarios under which the US turns in quite a radically different way away from our values, and that we need, consistent with the theme of this conversation, to increase our resilience so that we're not left exposed if we find that a partner on whom we've previously had strong alignment is suddenly in a very different place when it comes to values.
Fantastic, Olivia.
Thank you. So a great question to end on, and a difficult one. Of course we interact all the time with countries with whom we disagree or whose governments act in ways that are fundamentally different from how ours does. And I largely agree that it's been sensible of the British government not to offer a running commentary or not to always respond to everything Trump says, and particularly on issues like Ukraine and European security, keep working with others, keep working behind the scenes on what we can practically get the US to do. But I would be careful of completely divorcing what I think we're calling values in this conversation and our security. The UK is a middle power. We are dependent on some kind of functioning system of international law, multilateral cooperation, global economic governance that most states can reasonably sign up to. And we should be very thoughtful about the distinction between times when it doesn't make sense to say something or back at Trump because it's not in the interest of the UK and it's not in the interest of actually the outcomes we want, and times when we are genuinely concerned that a global power is undermining systems on which we do rely and we would miss if they were not there. So I think I agree actions in regards to Venezuela are very concerning, but I also think there's things we could do to bolster our own resilience, particularly to that strand of the US right that seemed particularly interested in undermining UK institutions. So that might involve thinking very carefully about election integrity. I think a much more momentum and much more focus on resilience to well-funded disinformation networks. This is not an easy topic. Government has been thinking about it a lot. But there are loopholes I think we could close. And just being a little bit more aware that there's quite an organised front in an aspect of the US right that I think we should be thinking about our own resilience too. And thinking about how we work with others, as has been a theme of this panel, and get more confident and independent about our relations with other powers. I mentioned the Indo-Pacific, but countries across the BRICS and the Global South who are going to become more powerful and influential over the sort of 5, 10, 15-year time span that we've been talking about. Yeah.
Fantastic, Gideon, and then we'll open up for some questions.
I think that one of the things to be aware of when you think of this sort of illiberal tendency in the United States and its impact on us is that it's not like we're this liberal society and they've gone off in this crazy direction and there's no connections between transatlantic connections, because I think that what's happening is that our culture war, if you want to call it, it's not a great phrase, but you know what I mean, is part of theirs and vice versa. So that if you look at, say, the attack on the BBC right now, it's coming from the White House as well as from right-wing forces within the UK. If you look at the Tommy Robinson rally, well, Elon Musk is tweeting in support of that. And so we have whatever phrase you want to use, radical right, populist right, liberal right, that looks to Trump for a lead, and which is not an inconsiderable force in our own society. Reform might win the next election. So I think we've got to think about it, be aware of that and think about it in that way. And, you know, in an ideal world, obviously the government has to fight reform at the next election. So there's a sort of tactical messaging question for them about, you know, do they try to say that Farage is just a surrogate for Trump, you know, and what are the diplomatic and political implications of that? Do you pin the two together or not? But I think, you know, on a more high-minded level, there's also a question of, well, how do you deal with this? And I think that rather than slightly wasting breath by offering this running commentary on things you may not like, you know, an ICE raid in Chicago or whatever, they can speak for themselves. You have to focus on to what extent does this begin to threaten our own institutions? Because we're playing defense at this point. They have a vision of an Anglosphere, you know, of 50, 60 years ago. They want to turn the clock back in their own country and in ours. You know, whether that's to do with multiculturalism, LGBT rights, any of that. I mean, and so we've got to think about it in terms of what can we defend here, and to what extent does that very conservative sort of trend in the United States threaten institutions that we need to protect, and how do we do that? Rather than saying, okay, I mean, it may involve occasionally saying you don't like something that's happening in the United States, but the point is, in a way, it's much more serious than that. It's not just happening over there; it's happening here, and we have to think about it in terms of like foreign interference, and how do we deal with that? I think that's really important. But but of course, the question of diversifying relationships, which we talked about. I mean, if you're going to do that as part of trying to make yourself less dependent on the United States, you also instantly run into human rights questions everywhere you look. So, you know, Rachel Reeves is in the UAE. That's an very important defense relationship, economic. There's a lot of, you know, Gulf money coming into Britain, great. But she is signing this new deal in the same week. There's this massacre going on in Sudan, in which the UAE is strongly implicated. So it's not like there's a sort of free pass out there where, and similarly, you know, I think it probably would, in economic terms, make sense to work more closely with China. But, you know, if you don't like Trump, what do you think of Xi Jinping? You know, so they're not these. There's not a set of easy like relationships out there that don't pose values questions. Europe possibly, although we'll see. You know, maybe if the Front National win the French presidential election, that'll get quite tricky as well. But yeah, so sorry, that's not a kind of plan for action. But all I'd say is that the kind of actually it is an aspect of the special relationship is that it's cultural as well. It's not just structural. And so at the moment we're talking about right-wing influence. But if you think back 5 years, you know, there's now a backlash against wokeism. Well, where did it come from? From the United States. You know, it was Black Lives Matter. It was Me Too. Those were movements that essentially were rooted in America and very quickly influenced our own culture. And that's kind of inevitable. It's going to happen, but you have to think about what's legitimate, what's just the spread of ideas, and what is actually an attack on our institutions.
Superb, thank you. Right, let's go to the room. We'll take them in threes. If we have got three, so I've got 1, 2, anyone on this side? Great. David.
Short one, I hope. Is there grounds for thinking actually the special relationship has been demonstrated to be more important under President Trump, in that it seems that he has actually paid more attention to the UK than expected, and it does seem that the UK's role, possibly even our central role in our international policy, is to try to civilise the US, if that word can be put.
Thanks very much for a fascinating panel, really, really interesting. 2 questions, one on intelligence sharing. Obviously, the US-UK is very important, and it's not to suggest that it should be downgraded. Obviously, it has its ups and downs, you know, and it doesn't all, it does shift. You know, Philby Burgess and McLean calls the US to pull back a bit. Possibly having is scope for expanding our intelligence sharing relationships with some of our East European allies. I mean, I'm thinking Finland, possibly the Baltic states, the Swedes. They have a deep understanding of Russia, which is perhaps something we could usefully develop. And then also possibly in Asia, you know, the South Koreans potentially, or the Japanese, their intelligence agencies would have a possibly better view of China than we do. The second on defence industry collaboration, and Gideon's points about, you know, large transport aircraft, space-based observation, I think are well made. There are capabilities in Europe, but we need to invest in them. But there's an issue on AI in defence. And I think one of the lessons from Ukraine is actually AI is not delivering what people like Calum and Olivia are saying. Actually, first-person view drones are not driven by AI. They're driven, as the term accepts, is people. So the drones that they're using are not being purchased by the US military at the moment. They are being purchased, I think, in other European countries, you know, the very cheap, mass-produced ones. The Danes are doing a lot of work on this, as are the Poles. Is this, so therefore, I think we need to be very cautious when we say, oh, well, we need to retain that defence industry relationship because of AI. And again, I take the point of the panel that you don't downgrade the UK special relationship, but there are alternatives which we could perhaps expand on. But I just want to warn you.
In the front right here.
Hello, Bernard Jenkins, Conservative MP. Well, a very interesting panel, but all a bit the same. And forgive me if I spoil the party, but what Christopher Mayer always said was that there isn't a special relationship, you have to make it special. And he said that whenever the British Prime Minister was in Washington, everyone talked about a special relationship, and as soon as the British Prime Minister left, nobody talked about a special relationship. And we have to accept that there has been a long trend of disinterest in the Atlantic relationship, going back decades. And the idea that the heyday of the Cold War was the sort of normal. Actually, it was the aberration. And we started the Second World War without the United States. And they didn't realise that their security was intrinsically bound up with European security, and only came in because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And at that time, Anthony Eden, before the Americans joined the war, Anthony Eden complained to a colleague that Churchill had no independent foreign policy of the United States. We've never had a choice, and I find the whole discussion is based on the idea we've got choices about how we promote our values, whether we should align more with France and Germany or Europe or even China. Gideon mentions, I know you're not seriously suggesting we rely on China for our national security, but we don't have any choices. We are in a desperate situation in the world now. And what we've got to rely on in the longer run is that America will come to its senses and realise that if the security of Western Europe continues to break down, their interests are intrinsically involved. They are inseparable from our own. And there is a current in American politics and on the Hill that you know, this is just a kind of regional problem. I mean, were there to be a nuclear exchange in Europe, would the United States be affected? Well, I mean, you just need to ask the question and you realise it's all about degrees of how bad it gets in Europe. So where do we place our bets? Are we going to rely on the protection of our country on a country like France, which is, we daren't even share the same intelligence with France that we share with the Five Eyes, in particular the United States. So the idea that Europe could be the ally of choice when they don't have the capability, they're divided about different perspectives on what to do about this, that and the other. I mean, if they were all like Poland and Estonia, I'd be in, but they're not. So we've got to recognise we're in a global conflict. The former head of MI6 said we're already at war with Russia. We're all in denial about how how serious this war is, the hybrid war that's been conducted against us every day, the cyber attacks, the closing down of international airports, the threats to critical national infrastructure. And fusion is still escalating. We have no choice. There is no time. The idea that we could build up a military capability that would be a match for Russia in the time available. All the C4I star capability in Europe is almost virtually all American. We rely on it completely. So, in the words of Christopher Mayer, who was sent to Washington and told by John Major to get up the opening of the President of the United States, that is the position we're in. We have no choice. In the medium term, in the long term, I suspect. And why would we ever want to ally with any country except the most powerful democracy in the world?
Fantastic. Okay, 3 questions. So is there a project here which is about what we're trying to do to the US? Do we have more intelligence and defence options than maybe we think? Or in fact, do we have no choices at all, including in the long run? Gideon.
So maybe a middle position between those two. I mean, I think that obviously that there are other intelligence relationships that you can cultivate and so on, but I think that the problem is, as I understand it, that the technological capabilities of the United States at the moment are just massively ahead of other countries, and there's also sort of cultural, I mean, in the specific intelligence way, so that the French, I think, are regarded as not entirely trustworthy, as Bernard said, but they do things basically the same way as the British. The Japanese, much less so, they're much more kind of hidebound, and so there's a reluctance to let them into the Five Eyes. They occasionally talk about it. So I guess you have to do a bit more of it, but be aware. In that particular domain, I think there is a limit to what you can do. You may ask yourself, do we overemphasize the importance of the intelligence relationship simply because it's, as the Brits like to say, something we're still world class at? You know, we are very good at it, and there was a certain kind of buzz when the British and the Americans and the Australians were saying ahead of the invasion, we know what's going to happen. We turned out to be right, and the Europeans were wrong. Great, but it still happened, and so maybe because we are big players in intelligence, we overemphasize the importance of intelligence. I don't know, it's something to think about. What Bernard's, I mean, a really interesting point. I mean, I would like to think one has some options other than sort of sticking your head up somebody's arse, but, which is more or less what you were saying is our only option. But I don't think, clearly we're highly dependent, but I don't think that, firstly, you can assume that America will be there. I mean, you mentioned the parallels of the First and Second World War. Well, there is a pattern that they didn't come until 1917 or 1941, and in both occasions it was actually Britain and France initially who were having to fight alone. And that the interesting thing is, I mean, if you want to look at it in a historical perspective, I think some of what Vance in particular and the other people around him represent is a revival of that isolationist tradition. And I had a very interesting conversation in Washington where I was making more or less the case you made to some of the people in that sort of world, and said, look, you ended up coming into the First and Second World Wars. You can't divorce yourself from European security issues. And the guy I was talking to said, yeah, but it was a terrible mistake to come into the First World War. We should never have done that. Why would we do that? So this is a guy who's pretty close to Vance. So so if there were a major crisis in Europe, would the Americans necessarily come in? I don't think so. Not. It kind of depends. They might, but I don't think you can completely counter it. They may eventually, in the old pattern, get drawn in, but not right at the beginning. Although obviously NATO does exist, etc., etc. But Article 5 is ambiguous, and Trump has his own reservations about NATO. So I think even for pragmatic sort of security reasons, you have to start trying to develop other relationships, even while understanding the depth of our reliance on I mean, that's just the last thing on this. So I think apparently NATO did some calculations about if we were at war, and I think they say if you had to fight tonight with Russia, what would the situation be? And I think they said that 44% of the military assets in Europe were American. So obviously you need that 44%, and some of the most important stuff is irreplaceably American, sort of as the Ukrainians have discovered, the intelligence that allows them to target and so on. And you can't replace those instantly, but I think it would be negligent not to, over the course of the next few years, try to reduce that dependence, because I don't think you can assume the Americans will be there.
Fantastic, Olivia.
Well, I'm a bit conscious of time, so I'll just make a couple of points on those questions. Bernard, I think your assessment is shared by the panel. We're a bit stuck, and we are very reliant on the Americans for our security, but I think relying on the idea that they would come in eventually begs the question, at what cost? Like, how long would that take, and what can we do in the meantime to bolster our ability to either deter Russia from whatever it is, further incursion into Europe, or be able to manage the situation prior to that. So I think this kind of dual strategy of keeping them as inside the tent as possible, there's plenty of things, there is no relationship that would replace, but there are relationships that would potentially bolster our ability to manage their unpredictability, and over the long term I think we should build those up. And maybe just to David's point, I think we should be very cautious about overemphasising our influence. And one thing, this wasn't your point, but I do think one thing that the Starmer government have played very well in terms of handling MAGA politically is they seem, to me, deeply sensitive to condescension, including from specifically from Europeans. And that seems like part of their political makeup. I mean, we might think that's absurd because they're the most powerful country in the world, but I think being very careful about assuming we have influence, or being very careful about assuming we're coming across like we're explaining to them how things work, is maybe where some European leaders have gone wrong in the past. That doesn't mean that we couldn't think about what role can we play, and I think it's the role Starmer and European leaders have been playing, like trying to demonstrate over time how difficult Putin is, how the position that Ukraine is in, and maybe getting somewhere with it, but doing it overtly is a political loser with this crowd, I think.
Super, final word to you, Calum.
Great. So thanks, David. I mean, I think your question in a way asks how obsessed should we be with the US? And I think to sort of build on what Bernard said, and I'll come back in a moment to sort of some of his other comments, but you know, there is a danger, partly because of the framing of today's discussion, that we are fixated on the US. Geopolitical trends are suggesting that even the US's position will become gradually less important over time, and we need to think about how we as the UK deal with a multipolar world. That might be, you know, that we just cleave ourselves to the US and see ourselves as having such aligned interests that will persist over time. But I think part of the challenge of this discussion today has been, can we rely on that continuing to be the case, even if we're occasionally a bit resentful about being the junior partner? Or is there a real risk that the US's commitment to values that we thought we shared, like multilateralism, like liberal democracy, like open trade, are actually significantly eroded, and therefore our interests are diverging? And I think the view from the panel, we focused quite a lot on security questions, but if we think a bit more about economic questions, I think we should be challenged to consider whether or not that alignment is persisting, and if not, what we should do about it. On the questions about intelligence, just briefly, you know, obviously many of us in the room are not as cited for obvious reasons on all of the aspects of intelligence sharing and so on, but a core principle of any intelligence matter is reciprocity and trust. And the UK has placed itself over decades in the Five Eyes arrangement. That's partly because there is communal sharing of intelligence, and therefore for any single partner to build new partnerships, there is then a question about how much intel is shared, and can the source of that intel be validated as only lying in the intelligence collection of UK agencies, such that it's our sovereign intelligence to share with other partners who may not be part of that network. That said, I think the prospect of working more closely with those on the front line with Russia is an interesting one, and one that we should definitely think harder about. So Bernard, I'll disappoint you by saying I agree with quite a lot of what you said. But specifically, I think you're absolutely right to draw attention, as we've both done in the House, to the threat posed by Russia, and to the idea that people are behaving as though this is, you know, hundreds of miles from us on the Ukrainian front, and not something that is taking place every single day in the UK. I think where we diverge slightly is in the view of what that means for our relationship with the US. And my view is that given the vagaries of this administration's approach, but also given structural and strategic shifts in US interest, it wasn't Trump who had a Pacific tilt, it was the previous Democrat administrations. It would be wise for the UK to think about our resilience and therefore not to lock in dependency over time. As other panellists have said, and as you pointed out, there is a dependency right now which we need to acknowledge, and we should be careful not to do things that upend that and leave us unable to draw on US capabilities. But that having been said, as you highlighted in a way yourself, it's been crises that have brought the US in behind this. And it's a fairly risky strategy to assume that the crisis will be big enough that the US will come right into the rescue. We need to actually have stable, predictable and reliable relationships that we can turn to at times of need. And it's part and parcel of the challenge that we should do that with the US, but also, in my view, by diversifying the sources of strength that the UK enjoys.
Fantastic. I think this has been a really rich conversation. I'd love to do another round, but we are out of time. So please just close by joining me in thanking our panel for their